Hello? 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 I'm Brendan McConville. I am the head of the David Center for the American Revolution here at the APS and professor of history at Boston University. I'm very happy to welcome you to another lunch at the library. It's an absolutely fabulous series where we get to see authors really discuss their work in new and exciting works. Before I introduce our speaker, Michael Hattem, I do want to say that the David Center is a collaboration between the DLAR, the David Library of the American Revolution, and the APS, and supports scholarship in the period of the American Revolution. The David Library's founder, Saul Feinstone, believed that the study of the Revolution was essential to creating an informed citizenry, able to comprehend and adapt the founding principles of our society to a changing world. The DCAR, the David Center, keeps his vision alive through our sponsorship and through our work of sponsoring scholars and through our sponsorship of speaking events and conferences. Today, I want to introduce our speaker, Michael Hattem. Michael will speak on his new book, The Memory of 76, published by Yale University this year. He is the author of Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, which was also published by Yale in 2020. The book will be for sale, his new book, in the back on your way out, and is at a reduced price. I have been instructed to remind you, is at a favorable price for this event. He received his PhD also from Yale and is currently the Associate Director at Yale of the New Haven Teaching Institute. I now hope that you will join me in welcoming Michael Hattem to the Lunch at the Library.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Brenna, and the David Center for the invitation to come speak about my new book, The Memory of 76, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to begin with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society nearly a decade ago. This is Eliza Wadsworth. She was a 20-year-old woman who lived at home with her family in Portland, Maine at the turn of the 19th century. And in January of 1800, having been moved by the recent death of George Washington, she asked her father, Peleg Wadsworth, who was a former Continental Army officer who was then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, for a memento of the revolutionary hero. Papa, I will tell you what I want more than anything I think of at present. It is a scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name, she wrote to him. But then she went a step further and she asked, had he hair? A lock of that I should value more highly still, but I suppose that's impracticable. Peleg's deep affection for his daughter prompted him to write to Martha Washington and enclose Eliza's letter. 2 weeks later, he received a reply from Tobias Lear, who was Washington's personal secretary. And Lear wrote, "The ardent wish expressed by your daughter and your earnest desire for its gratification have induced Mrs. Washington to comply with the request by sending this lock of hair, which I have the honor to enclose." Shortly after, Eliza received the package in the mail, and inside were 2 envelopes, one marked, "Read this first." In that envelope, a letter from Peleg read, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington." Then he wrote, "I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." Eliza described what happened next. She said, "I trembled with fear and dare not conjecture what it contained. And imagine my feelings when I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe, that for a moment I could not even shed a tear for so invaluable a gift. How shall I duly honor the relic," she wrote. "I feel as if it was too great for me to possess. I want to give thousands who've never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy." But Eliza's health was unstable, and just 2 years later, she was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she drafted a note about her most prized possession. "The hair of General Washington I leave in the care of my sister, and I wish it may be preserved in our own family while it can be safe." Eliza died on August 1st, 1802, and her letters and the lock of hair were preserved within the family. Her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. Now, Eliza's story is about more than just a young woman and a lock of hair. It's emblematic of the deeply emotional connection to the memory of the Revolution that Americans began to forge, especially in the early 19th century, and particularly as they realized that the revolutionary generation was rapidly disappearing. And that emotional connection has continued generation after generation throughout American history. And so I want to begin my talk today by exploring this phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with their revolution for nearly 250 years, which I think both historians and citizens alike have taken for granted to some extent. And I want to suggest that more deeply understanding that relationship has a lot to tell us about the past, the present, and the future, particularly as we continue barreling our way toward the 250th anniversary of independence. The memory of the American Revolution is our national origin myth. Now, historians typically use the term myth in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or an inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin myth, is a story that explains how a society or people came to be and defines its characters and principles and in the process of doing that expresses a vision of the future. So to mythologize the revolution is not merely to tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it, but it's to tell the story of the revolution for the purpose of explaining how the United States came to be, to define its character and its fundamental principles, and to set the agenda for the nation's future. And so I want to really explore what it actually means that we have mythologized the revolution, how that has worked, and what it tells us about Americans' relationship to their revolution. Myths are first and foremost stories, and like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act focuses on the coming of the revolution. It features a succession of legislation and events like the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, onwards towards independence. The second act typically features the war and is structured around a timeline of major battles: Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. The third and final act has typically recounted how in the 1780s the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention, and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. And this story has a logical beginning, middle, and end, and this sort of very traditional story structure has imbued the telling of the revolution with a sort of inherent literary quality. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the way Americans have told this basic story has followed a familiar form. The hero's journey is a common narrative structure in Western mythology, first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it is a sequence of commonly recurring plot points that he found in his studies of many hero myths. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell's work in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and others. How Americans have told the story of the revolution for nearly 250 years, I want to suggest, has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. So at the start, the hero, or in our case, the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. After a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over its colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous coercive acts in retaliation for the Tea Party. This unprecedented attack on colonial self-government causes colonists to create a Continental Congress. But of course, typically, the hero resists that call to adventure. And throughout 1774 and 75, Congress refuses to consider independence and instead focuses on reconciliation. Eventually, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. In July of 1776, that's taking me, there we go. In July of 1776, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. The hero then undergoes a series of trials and temptations, and for the revolution, those trials are represented by many of the war's battles. And though rooted in actual history, some of the war's most famous stories feature in their retelling mythical themes and near mythological scenarios. If we think about the Continental Army's daring escape from the Battle of Brooklyn, thanks to an opportune fog. There's also the successful attack on Trenton, right? Christmas Day, 1776. That's mythically depicted in Emanuel Lutz's famous 1851 painting when Washington crosses the Delaware with his ragtag army at night and scores an important victory against the feared Hessians mere days before the army's enlistments were to end. Tales like this have lent themselves well to the mythologizing of the revolution and the founders, for that matter, in popular memory. And though these stories are rooted in actual historical events, they've been told and retold in ways that lend them mythical connotations, including telling them as though they represented direct interventions by God. And this lends a predestined or even providential nature to the origin myth. Often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor and later receives the timely aid of a helper. And for the revolutionaries, that helper was France. And like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales where the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to cut off Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown possible. As a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. And in our story, the revelation of having secured independence led the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states, but quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, and so they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And once the atonement is complete, the hero receives the gift of the goddess and returns to the known world, which is now changed for the better thanks to the hero having undertaken their adventure and the illuminating revelations or first principles that they bring back with them. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us without being explicit. The mythical, literary, and religious traditions of the West have culturally hardwired us in a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses. That the story of the revolution has often been told like this helps us, I think, better understand Americans' unusual emotional connection to the revolution. These stories kindle intense emotional connections in part because they're usually intended to foster one's sense of belonging to a community. And Americans have long identified with a cast of unlikely underdogs who become larger-than-life heroes by surviving a series of trials and achieving a seemingly providential victory against all odds over the world's most evil empire. But there is a real civic power that comes from individuals collectively imagining themselves as the descendants of heroes who achieved the impossible. Many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, particularly in their youth, have had, and especially I think in the 19th century, have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. This mythologizing of the memory of the revolution has historically provided a nation that is still relatively young with an epic mythical past replete with heroes, villains, peril, daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world, and meaningful revelations about how the world or the nation should be. And throughout, there's always been a sense that good and evil exist, that they're clearly delineated, and most important, that the former triumphs over the latter. The popular memory of the revolution is a myth of the beginning of a new age that casts Americans as both its heralds and its heirs. And because of that, it lends a weight laden with meaning, purpose, and destiny to the American identity for more than 2 centuries. And this is in no small part why the revolution has been so central to our politics, culture, and national identity for nearly a quarter of a millennium. And understanding the form in which the story has often been told, I think, helps us understand Americans' emotional connections to their origin story. Now, there is actually a field of study known as Fandom studies that explores how people and groups relate to such stories and other facets of popular culture, how they express their deep emotional connections to those stories, and how those connections influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with their fellow fans. One of the most common ways that fan cultures do these things is through conventions, annual events where people who share a love of these stories or a specific story gather to discuss and express their connections to them. Americans do the same for the American Revolution every July 4th, every time they visit places like Mount Vernon, Independence Hall, the Boston Freedom Trail, and countless other museums and sites. Another way fans express their emotional connection to stories is by engaging in cosplay, where they dress up as their favorite characters from their stories. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. We also see this in our political culture if we look back recently to the Tea Party rallies of the 2010s. Still, another way that these emotional connections to stories are expressed is through fan fiction. There are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories featuring the characters of Star Wars or Harry Potter or other stories. And of course, Americans have done this too by creating and reading historical fiction, stories set in the Revolutionary era and often featuring real-life characters. And in the 20th century, the most popular of those was Johnny Tremaine. A fourth way that fans engage with stories is through fan art, or creating artwork that depicts famous scenes from these stories. And though this is not a comprehensive list, one final way I will mention is that fans visit recreations of the worlds of their stories. So fans of Harry Potter can visit Universal Studios theme park and walk down Diagon Alley. Lord of the Rings fans can go to New Zealand and visit the preserved set of the Shire. People visit them because they want to inhabit the stories that they love and the characters that they have such a connection to, because it strengthens their connection to those stories and to the community of fans. And this is the same reason that many Americans have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg, the Boston Freedom Trail, or Independence National Historical Park. So I think we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the Revolution have similarities to these fan cultures, which are created when stories take hold of people's imaginations and they establish deep emotional connections to those stories to the degree that they go on to form a part of their personal identity and foster a shared community. After all, nations are in no small part held together by the stories that they tell about themselves and their origins, and in that sense are as much a literary creation as a political creation. Now, this is not to expressly argue that nationalism is a form of civic fandom or that modern fandom has its roots in nationalism, but I think the similarities suggest something even more elemental about how we as humans relate to mythologized stories and the effects that they have on us. And so the power of the memory of the American Revolution comes in no small part, I would argue, because it's an origin myth told in the form of a hero myth. And this has contributed to Americans developing this unique emotional connection to its memory. Now, there is another origin of the revolution's hold on the American imagination that goes back to a pre-revolutionary cultural inheritance from Britain. And it helps us understand not just Americans' connection to the memory of the revolution, but their use of it. In the 18th century, many British subjects believed that history was cyclical rather than linear. That is, empires and civilizations rose and fell, or rose when their people had a sort of collective hunger for political power and economic prosperity. But once a society achieved those things, its people tended to become profligate and concerned with their own self-interest over the public good, and that ultimately led to their inevitable decline. And believing that this cycle had played out across history, British thinkers in the early 18th century argued that the best way for any society to temporarily forestall its inevitable decline was by recommitting to its quote-unquote first principles. And of course, since 1776, Americans have looked for their first principles in their own revolution. And the conflicts that we have had over the meaning and legacy of the founding for the last 250 years have been in no small part about choosing, defining, and justifying the most important first principles of the revolution. And as I show in my book, Americans' answers to questions about which principles are the first principles have changed over time, and there have often been multiple conflicting answers to these questions at any given time. But also this idea of returning to first principles to forestall an inevitable decline suggests that there is a kind of protection in looking back to the past
And so whether Americans are aware of it or not, we have sort of inherited and intensified this notion that there is a sense of protection that comes from looking back to our founding. And I think that this too helps explain Americans' emotional connection to their revolution. But what Americans over the last 250 years have done with that emotional connection, what first principles they found in the revolution or used the revolution to justify, has varied as widely as the political spectrum. Even within the general structures that I've laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific character or meaning to the revolution. And that's what a popular memory is. It's a way of telling or interpreting a story to attribute specific meanings to it. And as my book shows, Americans have interpreted the revolution and its meaning in many different and often directly conflicting ways. And most of them, even the ones that directly contradict one another, are rooted in the actual history of the revolution to some extent. But of course, none of them on their own are the whole truth, because the revolution was too rich and complex an event, was carried out by too diverse an array of peoples to ever be distilled into a single story or narrative, or to have one single meaning. After all, the founding generation itself never agreed on what the revolution meant or what its first principles were. So in other words, there is no single correct meaning or interpretation of the revolution. As a national origin myth, this complexity has allowed the popular memory of the revolution to be constantly contested throughout American history and adopted by Americans across the political spectrum. And the meanings that we attribute to it reflect our own times and are typically intended to justify our previously held beliefs. And so how we talk about the revolution often reveals far more about the present than the past, far more about us than about the revolution. And I would argue that essentially the revolution, the memory of the revolution, has provided us with a sort of shared political language that has mediated and helped shape many of our most divisive and hard-fought political conflicts. And so let me give you an example of this. From the early to mid-19th century. So for much of the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Britain and the Union of the States. And for that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances and the final paragraph, not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. But that began to change in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. In fact, it was the abolitionist movement that created the modern memory of the Declaration as being defined by the preamble and the principles of liberty and equality rather than independence and union. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mentioned the Declaration, including notably here in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831, one of the most important abolitionist newspapers of the era. Introducing the new publication, William Lloyd Garrison explained the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston. I determined at every hazard, he wrote, to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty. Then he continued, assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population. Similarly, abolitionists, meaning in Vermont, passed a resolution stating slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1839, the Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolved that the Declaration was, quote, the fundamental document of our national existence. In other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principles of equality and liberty, and they defined the revolution by the Declaration. This did not escape the notice of Southerners. In a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase, all men are created equal, as a rhetorical flourish, and claimed that, quote, upon this proposition, false as it is, rest the wild theories of liberty held by so many. In the hands of the abolitionist Southerners claimed the Declaration had become, quote, a very seditious instrument. For them, the Constitution was the fundamental or defining document of the Revolution, not the Declaration. After all, the Constitution had been Southerners' best tool for protecting slavery through repeated compromises and efforts to maintain the congressional balance between slave and free states. In the 1840s, though, Garrison and his followers also began to see the Constitution as the greatest impediment to abolition. And that notion was stoked by the first publication of James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention in 1840. Until then, Americans had known very little about what had actually happened at the convention. But now they could read the debates over representation and the compromises made to appease the slave states. In 1844, Wendell Phillips publishes a compilation of those portions of the notes that dealt with slavery in a book called The Constitution, a Pro-Slavery Compact. He claimed that it showed most clearly the details of that compromise which was made between freedom and slavery in 1787. And the main audience that he was targeting were abolitionist Americans who had long argued that the Revolution and the revolutionaries, including slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson, had been anti-slavery. For Garrison, Phillips, and their followers, the Constitution was corrupted from the start due to this compromise. And as a result, Garrisonians began to call for disunion because slavery could never be abolished under a constitution that began with compromises to slaveholders. Not all abolitionists agreed. In his famous speech on July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass, a former ally of Garrison, said, "I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution. It is a slander upon their memory, and interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document." This reinterpretation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document culminated in a famous incident on July 4th, 1854 in Framingham, Massachusetts, when during his speech, Garrison pulled out a pocket copy of the Constitution, declared it to be a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and set it aflame. These two founding documents were seen by both sides as fundamentally different and in direct opposition to one another. The Radical Declaration with its pronouncements of liberty and equality, and the Constitution which established and maintained law and order and slavery. Abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which document and hence which principles defined the revolution, and by extension, the nation. In some sense, the abolitionists and anti-slavery contingent hoped that the Declaration would save the nation from slavery, while Southerners hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. By the time of Lincoln's election and the secession that followed, Southerners' relationship to the Revolution had become strained. In 1857, George Fitzhugh, a well-known pro-slavery Southern writer, had argued that, quote, "liberty and equality are new things under the sun." In other words, these principles had not been part of the Revolution as originally remembered, but instead were new Northern principles. And he blamed those principles for all the problems that beset the North, including crime, immigration, moral decay, and democracy. Increasingly, Southerners came to see Jeffersonian democracy as having made abolition possible, thanks to the tyranny of the majority. Slavery was under threat because Washington, Adams, and Hamilton had failed to limit the democratic principles of the Jeffersonians. Jefferson was described as a, quote, "fanatical political monomaniac," who was the, quote, "father of all the calamities that are now being visited upon the nation." And the Declaration was, quote, "an instrument more properly expressive of the passionate and delirious ravings of a Parisian mob than the calm, dignified, and deliberate utterance of a nation." At the same time, a number of well-known Southern writers began to craft a new memory of the Constitution. They claimed that the founders never intended the union of the Constitution to be perpetual. They argued that the founders had signed on to the Constitution with the understanding that states could leave whenever they wanted. J.D.B. Du Bois argued that the government created by the Revolution, quote, "had the seeds of death planted in its Constitution because it tried to force together two fundamentally different and irreconcilable societies." And arguments like these were highly charged, as emotional as they were intellectual, and it had to be that way because these people are trying to convince their fellow Southerners to break this long-standing emotional connection that they have to the memory of the Revolution. And ultimately, to establish a new nation, Southerners had to reimagine the national origin myth in a way that would justify the creation of their own nation and serve as the basis for a Confederate origin myth. Now, this is just one of many examples of partisan conflicts over the memory of the revolution in my book. But I just want to give you a quick sense of just how far across the political spectrum the memory of the revolution has been used, from the far left to the far right. In the 1930s, as part of its Popular Front strategy, the Communist Party of the United States of America used the founders and the memory of the revolution to redefine itself and its agenda as an extension of the nation's revolutionary ideals and heritage. They adopted the slogan, "Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century," here combined with the famous painting Spirit of '76. The Communist Party found great value in reminding Americans that, quote, "this country won its independence in a great liberating revolutionary struggle." As a group who wanted to see the end of economic classes, they adopted the Declaration of Independence as a radical expression of equality at the heart of the nation's founding. The Communist Party continues the traditions of 1776, they claimed. And indeed, it was during these years of the Popular Front that the CPUSA enjoyed its widest following. At the same time, on the far right, the German-American Bund, which is was an American pro-Nazi group led by German immigrants, was also using the memory of the revolution to aid in its causes of isolationism and anti-Semitism. The Bund's goal was to oppose American intervention into World War II. And Washington was a popular symbol for the Bund because of his farewell address, which famously called on future generations of Americans to stay out of European wars. On the evening of February 20th, 1939, the Bund held a pro-America rally at the old Madison Square Garden in New York City to commemorate Washington's birthday. More than 15,000 people attended this rally, where the stage featured an imposing backdrop with a 30-foot full-length image of George Washington flanked on both sides by 1776 flags and swastikas. The speakers warned that as more Americans favored entering World War II, quote, "we are utterly and completely disregarding the admonition of George Washington today." The Bund used Washington in the memory of the revolution for its immediate political purpose of isolationism, but also because they knew its emotional power and that believed that it would help them to appeal to native-born Americans who were wary of foreign organizations like this. And ultimately, they tried to convince Americans that Nazism was a continuation of the American Revolution, and a not insignificant number of Americans were persuaded. Between these two examples, I hope to give you a sense of how the memory of the revolution has been used successfully, even by groups at the furthest ends of the political spectrum. And part of the reason that that has been possible is because of this unusual emotional relationship between Americans and their revolution, and the power of legitimacy that the memory of the revolution conveys in our political culture. But it's not just partisan division that can change the memory of the revolution or cause political conflicts to arise. So I want to tell you one more story here about how international politics and foreign policy can do this as well. This is Robert Goldstein. He was a Jewish German-American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. And after the success of D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, in which he was a minor investor, he became convinced that a similar large-scale historical epic about the American Revolution could be just as successful. So he raised a large amount of funding for what would be the first full-length feature film about the American Revolution, which he would write, direct, and produce himself. His film, he raised that money though, his film, The Spirit of '76, debuted in Chicago in May of 1917, 1 month after the US had officially joined the war against Germany with its new ally, Great Britain. And throughout the 19th century, Great Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the revolution. But relations between those two countries had become more friendly around the turn of the 20th century. Now, in attendance at this pre-screening were some critics and the city's controversial police censor board. Though one critic described the film as patriotic, the head of the censor board, this man named Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser, he disagreed. He objected to scenes that showed British atrocities, including one that showed a British soldier ransacking an American house and sticking his bayonet through a supposedly occupied baby's crib. There was another that showed a British soldier assaulting a young American woman. These scenes, he said, quote, would arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of the United States allies in the present war. So Funkhauser seized the film and called the Justice Department. Eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show the film so long as he deleted these offending scenes. Now, we don't know why, but before the film premiered proper in Los Angeles in November of 1917, Goldstein put those scenes back in. He was arrested immediately after the premiere and charged under the Espionage Act, which had been passed just a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent. Bail was set at $10,000. The LA Daily Times ran the headline, "War of Revolution Film Seized by Government." The case went to trial, and it was presided over by, I kid you not, Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe, who agreed that the film would, quote, arouse our revenge and question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. The media reported unfounded rumors that Goldstein was a German agent and that the film was German propaganda. Goldstein was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. He ultimately was released from prison early in 1921 after because of a review of convictions under the Espionage Act. And after a brief and unsuccessful effort to revive the film, he eventually had to leave the United States to find work. He next turns up in the historical record in Nazi Germany in 1935, where he was arrested for being unable to afford to renew his passport. Now, this story is an example of how the politics of the times shaped the ways that we remember the revolution. Goldstein thought that he was making a patriotic film that was based on a memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Britain was the evil enemy. His story is also a reminder of the great power of the memory of the revolution that we learn when we are young, and of how difficult it can be to let that memory go as we get older and newer memories of the revolution emerge to challenge or replace it. Goldstein's great tragedy is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war, and that the old memory had not only become outdated, but legally treasonous. If he had released the film a few years earlier or a few years later, things would have likely turned out very different for him. Instead, he was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution. And that film is lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of '76 has ever been found. This is just one example of how foreign affairs can have an impact on the memory of the revolution. And in my book, I also explore how the rise of the Cold War in the 1950s and its end in the early 1990s also caused significant changes to how the revolution was remembered. And so I want to argue in closing that the revolution matters most in the present, not because it happened, but because we remember it. Though the founders created the nation state itself, so much of the original governments and politics envisioned and created by the founders no longer exist. The federal constitution, the state constitutions have been amended, and in the latter's case, rewritten many times. In many ways, we've been living under a government of which just the barest bones of the structure was created by the revolution and the founders. And indeed, many founders claim that the revolution and American society had already been corrupted, betrayed, or mangled beyond recognition in their own lifetimes, not least by democracy. We simply no longer understand politics or society in the way that the revolutionary generation did. And so I would argue that the revolution has mattered primarily because we remember it and because of this unique role that its memory plays in American life. The memory of the revolution has served most importantly, I think, as a vehicle of expression, a sort of shared political language through which Americans define not only the past, but the present and the future. And though the memory of the revolution may seem to have done more to divide us than unite us, I would argue that fighting over the meaning of the American Revolution reveals an underlying shared perception about the importance of the revolution as our national origin story, and serves as an expression of the kind of civic engagement that is needed to maintain a democratic republic. So I've tried to explore just what it means that we mythologize the revolution, how that's worked, how it's played out in the practice of American politics. And really at the heart of that is the importance of how we tell the story of the revolution. That's one of the main takeaways that I hope readers of this book will come away with it from, a better sense and a better awareness of how the story of the revolution is being told in any given context, whether it's a unqualified triumph, a hypocritical failure, or somewhere in between. And so I've also tried to show that how we've told that story has fostered this unusual emotional connection as a way of helping to better understand the revolution's unique role in American life. And because the purpose of the national origin myth is to define and justify first principles and political agendas, conflicts over different memories of the revolution, like I've given a few examples here, have been constant throughout American history. And that is because the memory of the revolution provides us with this language that allows it to be an important tool for communicating across the many divides inherent in such a diverse nation and polity. And ultimately, the memory of the revolution has been an important way that Americans express their political beliefs in the present and their visions of the future. It has long been part of our birthright and our civic duty as American citizens to determine what the revolution means to us. And each new generation has produced multiple new memories of the revolution, often in direct conflict with one another. And as a result, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When Americans look at the revolution, we are effectively looking into a mirror. We define ourselves in part by how we define the revolution. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. And the revolution is always in the eye of the beholder, and though many may claim sole ownership of it, in a democracy, no one owns the past. And the memory of the revolution belongs to each and every one of us to make of it what we will, for better and worse. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, and someone caught my eye very quickly, so I'll hand it over.
Yeah, in 1967, on Christmas Day, up where the David Library was founded, somewhat later than that, they reenacted the crossing of the Delaware River, which they've been doing for a generation. And Washington's boat got less than halfway across the river when a bunch of high school kids from Newtown in Bucks County came out on kind of rowboat-sized boats with very weak engines and attacked the fleet. And this is like about 6 weeks before the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and things were going badly already, and it didn't go over well in the principal's office back at Newtown High School. I'm wondering, A, whether there's any other kind of history of kind of prankish mistakes like that. But I emailed the superintendent when I was teaching American Revolution at a college level and asked him about it, and he said, oh, my brother-in-law was one of those guys, and he put me in touch with this group of people, and it was an interesting story. There was no political intention about it whatsoever. It was just a bunch of young people being young, et cetera. So I'm wondering if is that the only time that anything like that has ever happened?
I would guess, because I cannot say for sure, that there is no way that is the only time that something like that has happened. There were what we might think of as examples of pranks, especially during the bicentennial era. There was a sort of evangelical radio personality from southern Jersey who was annoyed that the bicentennial bell that was given to the United States by Queen Elizabeth, that it had omitted some part of the biblical verse, and this was a denial of the Bible, and had when the Queen arrived, this person and his followers had a boat where they had a huge sign about how Queen Elizabeth hates the Bible. You know, there are all kinds of little little stories like that, and especially from the bicentennial era because it was so popularly contested.
So I heard a story a while ago, maybe apocryphal, that when the writer Tom Wolfe submitted an outline about a book on the American Revolution to his publisher, the publisher said, "Wrong war." It's been my understanding that what the publisher meant was that the war that is sort of primary to the American psyche is the Civil War, not the War of Independence. Do you have a view on that?
I would say that in some people's mind that is a contested notion, right? There have routinely been attempts, especially since the 100th anniversary of the Civil War in the mid-1960s, to give some kind of priority to the Civil War over the American Revolution. I mean, you know, just recently there have been multiple books. At first there were books calling the Civil War the Second American Revolution, you know, that kind of thing, in terms of sort of trying to, and what's happening there is that they're trying to replace the American Revolution and change the nation's origin story, right? To change the timing, the chronology of the nation's origin story. In recent years, the 1619 Project is another example of that, right? Like, say, it's not 1776, it's this other time, and whatever other time or event that you choose has meanings embedded in it that it's intended to convey. You know, for me, obviously, I think that the memory of the American Revolution has a sort of primariness over any other event, but you know, it is the case that the American Revolution, and this is maybe not about publishing, but in film, you know, there's so many great Civil War movies, World War II movies, Vietnam movies, right? Even Cold War movies. Is there a great American Revolution movie? You know, there is a very interesting debate to be had over why that is the case. We have never found a way to depict the revolution successfully on film, and the most likely explanation at this point seems to me that Goldstein put some kind of curse on that.
Sure. Hi. Thank you very much. I think often about, and certainly I enjoyed your talk today, but I can think of the line of Lincoln's line of mystic chords of memory, and how from even in his Gettysburg Address and about, you know, testing whether this nation or any nation can long endure, you know, and that the founding principles of the revolution, you know, could survive something like this. But he always referred to those memories, and he also thought the Declaration of Independence was the primary document. And I think also, you know, we talk about the Civil War, but we are still such a young nation. And in generations before, and even today, we for those who have been here for long term or short term, there are stories where they could talk about their great grandfather whose father, you know, maybe fought in the Civil War, or stories that tie us all the way back. And a lot of that are just oral history and stories. And it's that kind of strength, I think, which lends to the memory of 1776. So I'm very excited to read the book, and I just wanted to make those comments.
Yeah, I mean, I touch on that, you know, in the book. You know, another sort of way that the memory gets passed down is through naming practices. I touched on it a little indirectly here, but you know, that's a trend that begins around the Jubilee in 1826 and continue to pace for a lot of the 19th century, even into the early 20th century. So yeah, there are lots of ways, obviously, that the memory of the revolution is passed down, whether it's, you know, through some kind of oral tradition, whether it's through depictions, whether it's through its incorporation into like civic buildings and things like that. all of those are I'd say that there are examples of, the memory of origin stories in ancient Greece and ancient Rome that were passed down in exactly the same way. So.
Thank you. Wondering if there's something about the documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, that are not clear. In some ways, it feels like, the marketing document and the contract are kind of maybe ways to describe them. Mm-hmm. And people can use them however they like. Mm-hmm. But do you think there are shortcomings or confusions that lead to this issue you're highlighting about memory?
Yeah, I don't think it's shortcomings necessarily. I think it's just the fact that we have two founding documents, and they are both, they are so fundamentally different, right? And that is one of the reasons why, for sure, that the revolution has been so easily adoptable, by Americans across time and across the political spectrum, right? Because we do have these two very different founding documents, and a big part of the book, of the narrative of the book, is this sort of long-term sort of contest between the Declaration and the Constitution over which is the fundamental document of the American Revolution.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed your fitting of the American Revolution into kind of a Western mythical emplotment, and I wonder if you think there is any, maybe this is two questions, any need for or hope for a different emplotment in the future?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that story structure is, in some sense, it does not have to be, singularly determinative. That means that it doesn't necessarily, it's not that it can only have one meaning necessarily, right? But it is the case that in the last 40 years or so, certainly since the bicentennial, that historians particularly, have recognized the power of that narrative story structure and have been trying in all kinds of ways to, I'd say, subvert or modify that story structure, right? Whether it's changing the cast of characters in that story, whether it's changing the geography or the chronology of that story, right? And in a lot of ways, that's been continuous for the last 50 years, really one of the defining features of the memory of the revolution for the last 50 years. And we see that, those efforts by historians, they essentially make their way out into the popular culture, Hamilton, we think there was a children's series, a PBS children's series, Liberty's Kids, right? There's a lot of what recent historians were doing that makes its way into that. So that story structure is under pressure for modification, and that's as it should be, because I firmly believe, coming out of writing this book, that the fact that we contest the meaning and the story of the revolution is not a negative thing. It's actually a positive thing for our politics.
I want to thank you all for coming. I think that we should join together in thanking Michael. Perhaps not musically, but I think we should join together. Although I would note that Michael has defamed Al Pacino's best performance as an American Revolution.
Okay.
Yes, that was one of the great Al Pacino movies. In his new biography, he claimed after he did that American Revolutionary movie, yes, he did not work again in Hollywood for 5 years after he played an American Revolutionary. But I hope you'll join me in thanking Michael for a really fabulous talk today.
Thank you, everyone.